The FDD, the franchise disclosure document, is the most important tool in franchising. It's the foundation of your franchise offering, and it's the primary vehicle that franchisors use to comply with the franchise laws and regulations. And so we're going to get into the basics of the FDD, what's included in it, the FDD disclosure period, and even some registration and filing basics. At the most basic level, the FDD is the hub of your franchise offering. So on the one hand, you use the FDD to comply with federal and state franchise laws. And on the other, it's an instrument that you give to franchisees. So you know franchisees are going to be reviewing the data in the FDD to validate your franchise and compare it to your competitors. So the FDD itself, it's the hub that really melds together your franchise regulation obligations and your franchise sales activities. From a franchisor's perspective, when you look at the FDD, there's a number of things that should be going on or are going on. Within the FDD itself, you're complying with federal law, right? So you're complying with all the disclosure items that we'll talk about, and you're giving information that's going to be required under the federal franchise rule. You're also complying with state laws, and each state has certain requirements or addendums that are going to be added to your FDD. But also from a business standpoint, everything that's involved in your franchise offering, the initial franchise fees, the ongoing royalties, territory structures that you grant, whether or not you offer individual unit franchises or multi-unit, that's all laid out in your franchise disclosure document itself. And so from a FDD development standpoint, there's two goals going on. One is compliance with federal and state law, and the other is structuring your FDD so it's competitive and shows a much more compelling perspective about your franchise offering than your competitors. Now, the items in the FDD, there's 23 items. Under the franchise rules, they're really sections, but they're called items. And the 23 items cover a full disclosure process about who your franchise company is, who's involved in your management team, the initial fees that a franchisee will be paying, the estimated startup expenses, supply chain elements, territory structures, the entire underpinnings of what your franchise offering is about and how they legally relate for prospective franchisees. Some of the most important items in the FDD, at least from a development standpoint and for the franchisor, it's the initial fees, right? So what are your initial franchise fees? How do they relate to your competitors? Do you have multi-unit opportunities where a franchisee could sign a development agreement? Other fees, that's item 6 is going to tell information about your royalty structures, all the ongoing fees that a franchisee will be paying. Things that franchisees care about, what's the recurring royalty fee, what are brand development fund fees, and what other technology or ongoing obligations that are going to affect the franchisee metrics. In item 12, there's disclosures about the territory structures, what type of territory franchisee will get, whether or not it's exclusive, and what exceptions exist where, as a franchisor, you may or may not be able to sell within a franchisee's territory. One of the critical items, item 19, is the financial performance representations. And so within item 19, if you're going to share any financial data with a franchisee, it's going to have to go in your item 19. And we'll go into all of these in separate videos and separate materials, but at the heart of the FDD, there's 23 disclosure items, and they need to comply with the federal and state disclosure obligations. When do you have to disclose the FDD to your prospective franchisees? So the FDD itself is important in the franchise sales process. And while there'll be other processes and webinars you'll be offering to franchisees and information, the FDD itself needs to be provided to a franchisee not less than 14 days before they sign a franchise agreement or before they pay any fees to you as the franchisor. So we have that 14-day disclosure period. An important point there is that 14-day period doesn't start to run until the franchisee signs the receipt page of the FDD. And if we go back a second to the 23 items in the FDD, item 23 is the receipts, right? So at the end of the FDD is a receipt page, and the franchisee has to sign off on when they received your FDD, and that's going to start your 14-day window. Now, how do you count the 14 days? That's important because in many ways, your 14-day waiting period is really 16 days because the franchisee receives the FDD, signs the receipt page, the clock starts to tick on the date that the franchisee signs the receipt page. But the 14-day waiting period is a full 14 days. So that means you don't count the first day the franchisee received and signed the receipt page, and you don't count the last full day of the 14-day period. So in actuality, the franchisee, if you count the day they sign the receipt and the day they're signing the agreement, it's really 16 days. So you have to have a full 14-day waiting period. And then also as a franchisor, you need to be aware that there's also a mini waiting period, which is a 7-day waiting period from the date that you give the franchisee a fully completed franchise agreement. So other than items like filling in the blanks with the franchisee's name and information, if in the franchise agreement you include a designated territory for the franchisee, or other items that are very specific to that franchisee, there's another waiting period. And there, the franchisee needs to have the completed franchise agreement for 7 full days before they sign off. And now you could run the 7-day period with the 14-day FDD period. So for example, you disclose a franchisee with the FDD. If you know the territory and the specifics of their franchise agreement, you could also disclose to them the completed franchise agreement itself. In terms of basics, your FDD needs to be updated on an annual basis, right? So there's a couple of triggers. At a minimum, every FDD needs to be updated annually. And under the federal rule, it needs to be updated within 120 days from the end of your fiscal year. So if your fiscal year is a calendar year and ends on December 31, that means your FDD needs to be updated by April 30th of each year. But there's also update requirements if there's material changes in your FDD, if things that you disclose are now different or an event has occurred, such as certain litigation, you're going to be required to update your FDD on a more frequent basis. So when does your FDD expire? Well, at the most basic level, 120 days after the end of your fiscal year. So if your fiscal year ends on December 31, your FDD is no good as of April 30th. And at that point, you need to stop selling franchises. Now, keep in mind, that's under a federal rule. In states that have regulation, in the franchise registration states, you may have to terminate your franchise sales at an earlier date. It all depends on the state you're in and depends on the status of your franchise registration.